Beneath a merciless sun baking adobe walls, Elias Vance surrendered his grandfather's gold mine shares to a ledger keeper who possessed the secret to heal. Arabella's silver-laced scars in a crumbling mercantile where hope and dust coiled together eternally like smoke. Nobody in that dying border town understood why a prosperous rancher would trade solid veins of heritage ore for a weathered leather pouch, containing only a cryptic salve recipe and a whispered promise of impossible healing. The creditor, a gaunt man named Silas Creed, smiled with tombstone teeth while counting the deed to the Vance load, knowing the fortune exchanged was not for Arabella's release, but for the medical alchemy that could dissolve silver from living flesh. Elias walked out into the bleaching light, clutching the folded parchment as if it weighed more than the entire mountain his father had once blasted with dynamite, his shoulders carrying a secret heavier than any saddle. Arabella knelt by the creek behind the livery stable, her raw knuckles dragging wet linen over the shimmering lattice of scars that mapped her back like the cracked bed of a vanished river, each line a painful testimony. She never asked why the handsome smelter's son had started leaving small clay pots of cool, strange-smelling paste on her doorstep at moonrise, only that the agony beneath her skin began to retreat like a shamed animal. The scars were crafted by the mining consortium years ago, when they poured colloidal silver into flogged wounds to mark indentured servants as permanent property, a brand that glowed under lamplight and denied any future freedom. Arabella's debt was not monetary. It was the inescapable shine that made shopkeepers slide coins away and forced her to sleep in the cold loft above the grain store, dreaming of a body without accusation. Elias had first seen her behind the assay office, her spine a starburst of metallic threads, and something in his chest had fractured so completely that he swore an oath without moving his lips or consulting his pride. He had spent 3 months gathering old mining journals and bribing a Paiute healer with the last of his mother's silver brooch, finally learning that silver scarring could be reversed with a compound of desert rue, gold chloride, and crushed obsidian. Silas Creed, who controlled the medical debt books for the entire county, possessed the final missing ingredient, a phial of activated gold serum extracted from deep quartz, the very elixir that could awaken flesh to consume its own metallic prison. The price was not one nugget but everything, because Creed understood that healing an untouchable woman would shatter the cruel hierarchy that kept his profits fat, and he demanded the Vance inheritance as an example. Elias signed the transfer in a back room lit by a single tallow candle, his hand steady though his heart hammered, aware that he was exchanging his dead father's legacy for the chance to make Arabella whole. He returned to his cabin that night and stared at the empty gun rack where his grandfather's rifle once rested, now sold alongside the copper cookware, and felt a strange lightness creeping into his stomach despite the ruin. The first application of the golden salve made Arabella weep, not from pain but because a warmth she had forgotten since childhood spread between her shoulder blades, and for the first time a scar dimmed from mirror bright to flesh pink. Elias watched from behind the cottonwood tree, his jaw tight, as she touched her own skin in the dawn light with trembling fingers that traced lines which no longer shimmered, and he turned away before she could see his eyes. The town noticed the change within a fortnight, and the whispers grew like fungus after rain. How the scarred girl who cleaned the church pews now moved with a straight spine and a secret smile that unsettled their tidy assumptions. Meanwhile, Elias was evicted from his cabin and took a bunk in the bunkhouse alongside men who once tipped their hats to his father. He mucked stalls and said nothing when old acquaintances sneered at his fall. He sold his last horse, a Baymar named Sorrow, to buy more rue oil from a traveling apothecary, hiding the glass bottles inside his bedroll so that Arabella would never suspect the source of her continued deliverance. In the evenings, when the other hands played cards and spat tobacco, Elias crouched by the creek grinding obsidian into dust with a borrowed mortar, his fingers bleeding, his mind fixed on the map of her fading scars. Arabella began to believe the cure was a miracle from the Virgin of Guadalupe, for she found the clay pots always where the morning shadows pointed, and her prayers grew feverish with a gratitude she could not direct at any mortal. One afternoon, as she folded clean altar cloths, she realized her back no longer ached when she bent, and the terrible metallic smell that once clung to her skin had vanished like mist over the arroyo, leaving only the scent of sage. She stood before the cracked mirror in the vestry and wept, because the woman gazing back had no starlight wounds, only faint, ordinary lines that could have been forgotten stretches of childhood, and she dared to dream of being seen. Elias felt the truth in the way the wind changed when he saw her walking through the market without a shawl, her shoulders bare and unmarred, and his throat closed around a joy so sharp it was almost grief. He had not spoken more than 10 words to her since the day he first noticed the silver lattice. He had chosen to be a ghost, a benefactor dissolved by his own choice, because her dignity required no chains of gratitude. The social death was absolute. He ate alone. His name was removed from the county registry of landowners, and even the blacksmith who owed him a favor pretended not to recognize the hollow-eyed man who once brought him gold ore. But Elias discovered a strange fortune in his invisibility, for he learned to listen, and the whispers about Arabella's impossible healing began to tilt from suspicion to something resembling awe, undermining the consortium's control. The mine overseer, a bull-necked brute named Hollister, came to the bunkhouse one night and kicked Elias's cot, demanding to know where a penniless wretch had found the audacity to wander free while his betters watched fortunes dissolve. Elias looked up from the tin cup of water and said only that a man's worth was not stored in a vault, and Hollister laughed without humor before warning that the consortium would soon reclaim the cured merchandise if profits dipped. That threat sent ice through Elias's veins, because he understood that Arabella was still a ledger entry to them, and the healing he had bought could be undone if they decided to pour fresh silver into new wounds and call it order. He crawled from the bunkhouse under a sliver of moon and went to the old smelter, where he found the hidden strongbox still wedged behind the furnace, containing his grandfather's last forgotten assay map and a single gold watch. The watch, heavy as a heart, had been his mother's bridal gift, engraved with a sunrise, and he sold it the next morning to a tin pan peddler for enough coin to buy passage out of the territory for one person. He slid the train voucher under the church door with a note written in a disguised hand, urging Arabella to flee to a cousin in Oregon where no one knew of silver-marked pasts, and he signed it only a friend. Arabella found the ticket at dawn and pressed it to her chest, but instead of rushing to the station, she marched to the assay office and demanded to know from the clerk who had been paying down the scar debt she never owed. The clerk, a nervous boy named Tomas, finally broke under her stare and confessed that Elias Vance had traded his entire mine for a medical formula registered under the name Golden Rue Compound Patient A, and then vanished into poverty. She ran through the dusty streets with her healed skin electric under the sun, her mind struggling to reconcile the silent, threadbare stranger she sometimes glimpsed at the livery with the man who had owned everything and now owned nothing at all. Arabella found him behind the stables, shirtless and sweat, streaked, hands deep in a barrel of lime, his ribs visible through skin that had once been solid, and for a long moment neither spoke as the world tilted on its axis. She said his name once, and he flinched as if struck, then slowly straightened, and she saw in his eyes a vast and terrifying tenderness that had been burning. Unseen across every sunset, she had thanked the sky for instead of him. Elias tried to step back, to mumble that she owed him nothing, but Arabella closed the distance and placed her palm flat against his chest, right over the place where a fortune used to beat, and she said his heart was the only gold left. The confession spilled out of her then, how she had dreamed of a faceless liberator and never dared hope he was flesh and bone, a man who gave not to possess but to restore the very thing that made her human. He broke in that stable doorway, the dam of silence giving way, and told her about Creed's ledger, the salve, the crushed obsidian that cost more than diamonds, and the nights he ground minerals until his nails bled because her dignity was worth any price. She listened without flinching, then took his scarred hands and kissed each bruised knuckle, telling him that she was no longer a debt, but a woman who would spend her healed body building a life that honored such impossible, invisible love. News of their reunion rippled outward, and the consortium, sensing a rebellion of sentiment, sent Hollister with 2 armed men to seize Arabella for contract reclamation, claiming the cure itself violated their ownership clause over branded flesh. Elias stepped between her and the rifles, his empty hands raised, and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of the mountain he had lost, declaring that her silver was gone and with it their unholy hold, because flesh and spirit were not commodities. The standoff drew a crowd of townsfolk who had long feared the consortium, but also remembered the quiet man who had once paid a widow's flower bill without fanfare, and their silence became a shield of collective hesitation. Hollister sneered and cocked his revolver, but before the hammer could fall, the county marshal, an old ranger named Bellamy, rode up with a telegram from the territorial governor that voided all silver branding contracts retroactively, declaring the practice illegal. The consortium's power evaporated in the afternoon glare like dew on a hot stone, and the townsfolk let out a breath that became a ragged cheer, while Arabella clutched Elias's arm and wept for all the unseen people whose scars still ached. In the weeks that followed, the assay office posted a public notice of debt nullification, and Elias was offered his grandfather's claim back by a repentant town council, but he refused the deed, saying the mine had served its purpose when it bought a woman's skin. Arabella used her newfound freedom to apprentice with the Paiute healer, learning to make the golden roux salve so that no scarred person need ever trade a fortune for restoration, and her hands became a quiet revolution in glass jars. Elias built a small smithy beside the creek, forging not gold but simple tools for ranchers. And every evening Arabella returned with stories of patients whose shining marks were fading, and they would sit on the stoop watching the sun gild the cottonwoods. Their love grew without fanfare, rooted in the humus of shared sacrifice, and the children who later came to their door never understood why their father's hands trembled when he held a jar of honey, or why their mother's back bore faint, priceless traces. The true wealth was never in the ground, Elias would say on winter nights to the fire, but in the eyes of a person who learned that their body was not a monument to cruelty, but a canvas where grace and grit could paint an entirely new sunrise. Arabella would lean her head against his shoulder and remember the silver gleam that once condemned her, now replaced by the simple warmth of wool and the steady heartbeat of a man who traded gold for scars without ever seeking a receipt. The town gradually forgot the details of the scandal, but women would sometimes bring their daughters to the creek, point to the forge, and whisper that the richest man in the territory once emptied his pockets so a girl could hold her head high under heaven. And if you walk that same creek at dusk, they say you can still find traces of gold dust mixed with crushed obsidian glinting in the sediment. A permanent glitter left by hands that understood dignity was the one currency the grave could not claim. The story of Elias and Arabella became a fireside legend told in bunkhouses and church basements, a quiet rebellion against the ledger books that tried to turn human flesh into interest, and it spread farther than any stock ticker ever could. A doctor from back east eventually wrote a monograph on silver poisoning reversal, citing the forgotten compound of rue and gold chloride, never knowing it was born in a dusty mercantile where love signed away a mountain to heal a single spine. Silas Creed died penniless in a Denver flophouse, haunted to his last breath by the image of the deed he had taken, not realizing the real wealth had already slipped through his bony fingers and taken root in the healed shoulders of a woman he considered property. Elias lived long enough to see his grandchildren ride horses across the reclaimed Vance land, which the county deeded back to Arabella after his death, and his gravestone bore only the words, "He traded his gold, leaving the rest for God to finish." Arabella outlived him by 2 decades, And in her final year, she dictated her memoir to a traveling scribe, ending every chapter with the same refrain. A scar is not a sentence but a doorway, and true love leaves no entry in the ledger, only light. The frontier kept their secret close, the way the desert holds rain and fossil beds, so that every wanderer who stumbles upon the old smithy foundation might feel inexplicable hope rise like a lark from the sagebrush, singing of a debt paid in silence. And if you subscribe to West Old Stories Official, we will keep uncovering the forgotten souls who traded gold for grace, proving that the wildest Western tales are not always about gunfire, but about the quiet, restorative power of human dignity. Like this video if you believe a man's wealth is measured by what he restores, not what he hoards. And tell us in the comments how far you would go to heal a wound the world called permanent and see someone stand tall again. Share this story with a friend who needs to remember that invisible sacrifices still echo across time like a hammer on a forge that no longer shapes gold but beats out a rhythm of redemption beneath an eternal, forgetting western sky. The desert wind has a memory, and it whispers the name of a rancher who traded everything for the shimmer on a woman's back. A debt settled not in coins, but in the warm, living truth that every scar can become a sunrise when love dares to pay the full cost.